stand on the rooftop of Marina Bay Sands tonight, on the deck they call Level 57, and look down. Container ships stack up on the horizon like floating city blocks. And one of them arrives or leaves this port every few minutes. The country beneath your feet has no oil. It has no farmland worth mentioning. It has so little natural fresh water that much of what its people drink is piped in from another country. It is smaller than New York City. And yet, by some of the most common measures economists use, it ranks among the very richest nations on Earth. 200 years ago, the world knew this island, when it thought of it at all, as a swamp with a fishing village of about 1,000 people. 60 years ago, it was a fragile new country that its neighbors had just voted out of existence as part of their own. A place with no army, not enough homes, and no guarantee it would survive the decade. What happened in between is a story of pirates and opium, of an empire's greatest fortress falling in 7 days, and of a man who bet an entire country on a single idea. This is the entire history of Singapore, and it begins with a legend about a lion that probably never existed. Chapter 1. The Lion City That Had No Lions. Every country tells itself a story about how it began. Singapore's story starts with a prince, a storm, and an animal that should not have been there. According to the Malay annals, a collection of royal chronicles written down centuries after the events they describe, a prince from the island of Sumatra was sailing these waters sometime in the 1200s. His name was Sang Nila Utama. When his ship was caught in a violent storm, the story says he threw his own crown into the sea to calm the waters. He landed on an island with white sand beaches, and there, on the shoreline, he saw a strange animal, fast and powerful, with a red body and a black head. His advisors told him it was a lion. The prince took it as a sign of fortune, and he named the island Singapore. In Sanskrit, that means Lion City. Here is the problem. Wild lions have never lived in Southeast Asia. Whatever that prince saw, if he saw anything at all, it was probably a tiger, or it was simply a good story invented later to give a royal family a glorious origin. Historians treat the tale as legend, not record, but notice what the legend is doing. It is claiming that this island was chosen, that it was destined to matter. And the strange thing, the thing that makes Singapore's history so compelling, is that the legend turned out to be right twice. Because Singapore did not rise once. It rose, and it fell, and centuries later it rose again. Let's talk about the first rise, because most people, including many Singaporeans, know almost nothing about it. 700 years ago, this island was not empty. It was a working trading port called Temasek, a name that likely means sea town in Old Javanese. And we do not have to rely on legends for this part, because we have two kinds of hard evidence. We have an eyewitness, and we have the ground itself. The eyewitness was a Chinese merchant named Wang Dayuan, who traveled through these waters in the 1330s and wrote down what he saw. He described a settlement here where native people and Chinese residents lived side by side, which makes this one of the earliest recorded overseas Chinese communities in the region. He described trade in local products, hornbill cascus, cotton, tin, and he described something else, pirates. He warned that ships passing a nearby strait risked attack by fleets of raiding vessels, even 700 years ago. The waters around Singapore were busy enough and rich enough to be worth robbing. Then there is the ground. In 1928, labourers digging on Fort Canning Hill, right in the heart of the modern city, struck something in the soil. It was a cache of gold ornaments, armlets and rings of a quality that suggests royalty or serious wealth once lived on that hill, crafted centuries before any European ship reached these waters. Decades later, beginning in the 1980s, archaeologists opened systematic digs on the hill and along the Singapore River, and the ground gave up more. Chinese porcelain from the Yuan dynasty, glass beads, coins, fragments of fine pottery buried under one of the most modern cities on the planet. This was not a fishing camp. This was a real port city, plugged into the trade routes that connected China to India and beyond. And that is the key to everything in this video. So let me pause on it. Look at a map of Asia. Find the narrow channel of water between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. That channel, the Strait of Malacca, is the shortest sea route between China and India, between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. For 2,000 years, an enormous share of everything traded between the eastern and western halves of Asia has floated through that funnel, and Singapore sits at the funnel's narrowest exit, like a toll booth built by geography. Whoever holds this island holds a gate on one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. In the 14th century, that made Temasek rich, in the 21st century, it makes Singapore rich. The location never changed. Only the people managing it did. So what happened to Temasek? Why did the first Singapore die? In short, it was caught between giants. To the south, the Javanese empire of Majapahit was expanding. To the north, the Siamese kingdoms were pushing down the peninsula. A small, wealthy port squeezed between two hungry powers is a port that gets attacked. The chronicles and later Portuguese accounts differ on the details, and historians still debate exactly what happened. But the general shape of the story is this. Sometime near the end of the 1300s, a ruler of this island, a man remembered as Parameswara, was driven out. Some accounts say he fled after Majapahit forces attacked. Others say he had murdered a local ruler and was pushed out in revenge. What we know with more confidence is where he went. He fled up the coast and founded a new city called Malacca, which within a generation became the greatest trading port in Southeast Asia. Malacca's rise was Singapore's fall. The traders followed the new sultan. The toll booth moved up the strait, and Temasek faded. It did not vanish completely. Recent scholarship suggests a settlement lingered here under the sultans of Johor. And there was even a small trading post and a royal official on the river in the 15 and 1600s. But by the time the 18th century closed, the glory was long gone. What remained were the Orang Laut, the sea people, communities who lived on boats and in stilt villages, fishing these waters as their ancestors had for generations. A Malay official called the Temenggung governed loosely on behalf of a distant sultan. Perhaps 1,000 people lived here. Tigers hunted in the interior. The gold on Fort Canning Hill lay forgotten under the soil, and the hill itself was known to locals as the Forbidden Hill. Haunted, people said, by the ghosts of ancient kings. Hold that image for a moment. A jungle island, almost empty, whose own residents walked past a buried royal city without knowing it was there. That is what a European ship's officer would have seen from the deck in the year 1800. Nothing, and that is exactly why what happened next is one of history's great bets. Because one man looked at this forgotten island and saw what Wang Dayuan had seen 500 years earlier. Not what it was, what the map said it could be. His name was Stamford Raffles, and he was about to claim an island for an empire with signatures instead of soldiers. Chapter 2. The Man Who Saw a Harbour. To understand the man who founded modern Singapore, you have to understand how badly his life should have turned out. Thomas Stamford Raffles was born in 1781 at Sale, on a merchant ship off the coast of Jamaica. His father was a ship's captain who left the family with little but debts. At 14, the boy had to quit school and take a job as a clerk with the East India Company in London, copying documents by candlelight for pennies. No fortune, no famous family, no university. In the world of the British Empire, men like him were not supposed to become anything. But Raffles had 2 weapons. He worked with an intensity that alarmed the people around him, and he learned. While other clerks drank, he taught himself languages and science at night. When the company posted him to the island of Penang in 1805, he did something almost no British official bothered to do. He learned Malay. He studied the region's history, its courts, its old empires, and buried in those old chronicles, he read about a forgotten island at the tip of the peninsula that had once been called Singapura. By 1818, Raffles was governor of a fading pepper port on Sumatra, and he was watching Britain lose Southeast Asia without a fight. The Napoleonic Wars were over, and London had handed the region's great prizes back to its ally, the Netherlands. The Dutch now controlled the ports on both sides of the Strait of Malacca, and they squeezed. Foreign ships paid heavy duties or were shut out entirely. Every ship sailing between British India and China had to pass through waters where Britain did not hold a single good harbour. Raffles sailed to Calcutta and made his case to the Governor-General of India. Lord Hastings, give me permission, he argued, to plant a station at the southern mouth of the strait. Hastings gave him a cautious yes, with strict instructions to avoid any collision with the Dutch. Raffles took that narrow permission and stretched it as far as it would go. On the 28th of January, 1819, his ships anchored off the mouth of the Singapore River. With him was Major William Farquhar, a Scottish officer who had spent years in the region and spoke Malay fluently. On shore they found the Temengong, the local Malay chief, presiding over perhaps 1,000 villagers and sea people. The island belonged to the Sultanate of Johor, and the Sultan of Johor was aligned with the Dutch. Legally, Raffles had no clear right to be there at all. What he did next was one of the most audacious legal maneuvers in the history of the British Empire. The old Sultan of Johor had died years earlier, leaving 2 sons. The younger son sat on the throne, recognized by the Dutch. The elder son, Tengku Hussein, had been passed over and was living in obscurity. Raffles saw his opening in that family quarrel. He took the position that the elder brother was the rightful sultan, had Hussein quietly brought to Singapore, proclaimed him ruler of Johor in a ceremony on the beach, and then signed a treaty with the very man he had just crowned. On the 6th of February, 1819, Sultan Hussein and the Temenggung granted the East India Company permission to establish a trading post, in exchange for yearly payments of 5,000 Spanish dollars to the Sultan and 3,000 to the Temenggung. Notice what that first treaty was and was not. It was not a sale of the island. It was a foothold, a licensed trading post on someone else's land. Full British control came 5 years later. In 1824, when a second treaty saw the Sultan and Temenggung cede the island outright in return for larger payments and pensions. A deal struck between parties whose bargaining power could hardly have been more unequal. That same year, Britain and the Netherlands, choosing to split the region rather than fight over it, drew a line down the Strait of Malacca. The Dutch gave up their claims north of the line. The British gave up theirs to the south. That line, drawn by 2 European powers an ocean away, still exists today. It is roughly the border between Malaysia and Indonesia, and Singapore stayed British. Now, here is the part the statues do not tell you. Raffles is everywhere in modern Singapore. The famous hotel carries his name, and Sudu Hospital, schools, businesses, streets. You could be forgiven for thinking he built the place. He did not. Across the rest of his life, Raffles spent less than a year in total on the island, in 3 short visits. The man who actually raised Singapore from the mud in those first years was Farquhar, who ran the settlement day to day, kept it fed, and welcomed the first waves of traders. But Raffles made the one decision that mattered most. He declared Singapore a free port. No duties, no tariffs, nothing. At a time when the Dutch taxed everything that floated, any merchant of any nation could sail into Singapore, trade, and leave without paying the government a cent. It was a magnet, and Asia felt the pull immediately. Malay traders, Chinese junks, Indian merchants, Bugis fleets from the eastern islands, Arab dealers, European ships. Within 5 years, the population had grown from about 1,000 to more than 10,000, and the value of trade already ran into the millions of dollars. The partnership between the 2 founders ended in bitterness. When Raffles returned in 1822, he found a boomtown that was also, in his eyes, a moral disaster. To fund the settlement, Farquhar had legalized and licensed gambling dens and opium sales, and had turned a blind eye to slave trading. Raffles, who despised slavery, was horrified. He stripped Farquhar of his position, redesigned the town with a detailed plan whose outlines you can still see in the street map today, and sailed home. Farquhar spent the rest of his life demanding recognition as Singapore's true founder. He never got it, and Raffles got the crueler ending. He went home to England broken by tragedy, Having buried 3 of his young children in the east, the ship, carrying everything he owned, caught fire and sank. The East India Company, instead of thanking him, billed him for the costs of his adventures. He died in 1826, one day before his 45th birthday, of a suspected brain tumor. His local vicar, a man with financial ties to slavery, denied him a proper memorial. The man whose name now marks one of the richest cities of the modern age died in debt, and it took decades for anyone to properly mark his grave. He never saw what his free port became. Almost nobody in 1826 could have imagined it, because the port was about to be flooded with people, money, and vice on a scale that would make it one of the wildest places on earth. Chapter 3. Opium, Tigers, and Coolies. Every gold rush town in history has the same problem. The money arrives faster than the law. In California, it was gold in the rivers. In Singapore, it was gold in the water itself. The endless stream of trade pouring through the strait. And just like a gold rush town, early Singapore was booming, lawless, overwhelmingly male, and astonishingly dangerous. Start with the numbers, because they tell you how fast this happened. About 1,000 people in 1819, 10,000 by 1824, around 80,000 by the 1860s. The overwhelming majority of the newcomers were young men from southern China, fleeing a homeland racked by famine, rebellion, and a collapsing dynasty. They came from the provinces of Fujian and Guangdong, speaking dialects: Hokkien, Teochew, Cantonese, Hakka, that were often mutually unintelligible. By the middle of the century, Chinese immigrants were the majority of the population, and they have remained the majority ever since. Alongside them came Indians, many brought by the British as labourers, soldiers, and convicts, and Malays from across the archipelago. The modern ethnic mix of Singapore, roughly 3/4 Chinese, with large Malay and Indian minorities, was forged in these decades. Now look closer at how those young Chinese men actually arrived, because this is one of the darkest chapters in the region's history. Most could not afford the passage, so they came on credit, packed into the holds of junks and later steamships, in conditions so foul that the trade earned a nickname in Chinese that translates as the selling of piglets. A man would sign away his future labor to pay for his ticket. On arrival, brokers sold his contract to plantation owners or mine operators. He was called a coolie, and until he worked off his debt, plus interest, plus whatever charges his employer invented, he was not entirely free. Some worked their way out in a year or two and started small businesses. Many others were bled dry by debt, disease, and the 2 great traps waiting for them on shore: gambling and opium. And here we arrive at the most uncomfortable fact about colonial Singapore, one that rarely makes it onto the heritage plaques. The government was in the drug business. Remember, Singapore was a free port. No taxes on trade. So how did the colony pay for itself? It sold monopoly licenses to syndicates, mostly wealthy Chinese businessmen, for the exclusive right to sell opium. Along with liquor and gambling, the opium license was the crown jewel. By some estimates, opium provided somewhere around half of the colonial government's revenue for much of the 19th century. Think about what that means. The roads, the courthouses, the police who kept order, much of it was paid for by the addiction of the very laborers who were building the city. The coolie broke his body hauling cargo, spent his wages in a licensed den to dull the pain, and his money flowed upward to fund the government that licensed the den. It was a perfect, terribly machine. Where the law was thin, other powers filled the space. The immigrants organized themselves into brotherhoods, secret societies with oaths, initiation rituals, and their own soldiers. To a frightened newcomer stepping off a junk, the society was a bank, an employment agency, and a family. It was also a protection racket that controlled the opium dens, the gambling houses, and the trade in women. Because in a colony where men outnumbered women by more than 10 to 1 at times, prostitution was an industry. When the societies fought, the island burned. In 1854, a street quarrel between Hokkien and Teochew groups exploded into 10 days of open warfare across the island. Villages were sacked and hundreds of people were killed, with some estimates running toward 500 dead. While the tiny colonial police force could do little but guard the European quarter and wait for it to end, and beyond the edge of town, something else was hunting. The interior of the island was still jungle, and as planters cleared it for crops of pepper and gambia, they pushed into the territory of tigers. The big cats swam across the narrow strait from the Malayan mainland, and they learned that plantations were full of slow, unarmed prey. Through the middle of the 19th century, tiger attacks on plantation workers became a grim routine. Newspapers of the era claimed the tigers were killing a man a day at the worst points. A figure historians treat with caution, but even the sober records make clear that hundreds of laborers died in the jaws of tigers over the decades. The government paid bounties. Hunters dug pit traps, and still the killings went on. It gives you the true picture of this place. A man could survive the voyage from China, survive the fever, survive the gang wars, and still be dragged into the undergrowth by a cat the size of a sofa. The killings faded as the jungle shrank, and the last wild tiger on the island is generally said to have been shot around 1930, the most famous tiger story of all, though is stranger. In 1902, a tiger that had escaped from a traveling show was cornered and shot beneath a building attached to the Raffles Hotel, and the tale grew in the telling until half the world believed a wild beast had wandered into the bar. Yet through all of it, the blood, the smoke, the debt, the city worked. That is the paradox you have to hold on to. Out of this chaos rose merchants of legendary skill, many of them Chinese businessmen who had arrived with nothing, men like Tan Tok Seng, a vegetable seller turned tycoon who paid for a hospital for the poor that still bears his name today. The port kept growing because it offered the one thing every trader wants and almost no government in history has been willing to provide. It let people keep what they made. By the 1860s, Singapore was rich, violent, indispensable, and still, in the grand scheme of the British Empire, a sideshow at the end of a long sailing route. Then, in a single year, two things happened on opposite sides of the world. A canal opened in Egypt, and the age of sail began to die. Together, they would turn this rowdy port town into one of the most important cities on the planet. Chapter 4. The Crossroads of Empire. In November of 1869, a French-built canal opened through the desert of Egypt, connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean. On the day the first ships passed through the Suez Canal, every map of world trade quietly redrew itself. The voyage from London to Singapore, which had meant months of sailing around the entire continent of Africa, suddenly shrank by thousands of miles. And the canal favored a particular kind of ship. Sailing vessels struggled in its narrow channel and in the windless Red Sea beyond. Steamships did not. So the canal did two things at once. It shortened the road to Asia, and it handed that road to steam. Here is why that mattered so much for one small island. A steamship is a hungry machine. It cannot cross an ocean without stopping to refill its bunkers with coal, which means the age of steam was really an age of refueling stations. Whoever owned the great coaling stops along the route owned the route itself. And sitting exactly where the Indian Ocean turns toward the South China Sea, at the mouth of the strait every ship now had to use, was Singapore. The port that had been a useful stop for sailing traders became a place the world's shipping could not avoid. Within a few years of the canal opening, trade through Singapore surged. New docks and wharves spread along the deep water at Tanjong Pagar, and the harbour filled with black smoke and iron hulls. In 1871, an undersea telegraph cable reached the island, and for the first time, a merchant on the Singapore River could exchange messages with London in hours instead of months. Distance was dying, and every time distance died a little more. Singapore grew. Then the island's luck did something almost unfair. The 20th century arrived, and it turned out to run on two commodities, and both of them came from Singapore's backyard. The first was tin. The Malay Peninsula to the north held some of the richest tin fields on earth, and the canned food industry of Europe and America had an endless appetite for the metal. The second was stranger. In 1877, a batch of young rubber trees, grown from seeds smuggled out of Brazil by way of London's Kew Gardens, arrived in Singapore. For years, nobody took them seriously. The man who changed that was the director of the Singapore Botanic Gardens, a scientist named Henry Ridley. Ridley was so relentless about pushing rubber on every planter he met that people called him Mad Ridley. He developed a method of tapping the trees for latex without killing them, and he preached rubber to anyone who would stand still long enough to listen. Then, around the turn of the century, the automobile arrived. Every car in the world needed 4 rubber tires, and a vast share of the rubber trees of Asia traced their lineage through those gardens. Malayan rubber and Malayan tin flowed down the peninsula, through Singapore's warehouses and auction rooms, and out to the factories of Detroit and Manchester. By the early 20th century, this island was one of the great commodity ports of the world, and American industry was one of its biggest customers. A tire rolling off a Ford assembly line had, in a real sense, passed through Singapore on its way there. The money changed the city's face. Grand banks and trading houses rose along the waterfront. Gas lamps, then electric lights. Rickshaws by the thousand, pulled by men who had stepped off ships from China weeks before. And in 1887, 4 Armenian brothers named Sarkis opened a beachfront hotel with a name chosen to flatter the colony's founder, the Raffles Hotel. It grew into a white palace of verandas and ceiling fans, the most famous address east of Suez, where writers like Rudyard Kipling and Somerset Maugham stayed and wrote, and where, sometime around 1915, a bartender named Ngiam Tong Boon is credited with inventing a pink gin cocktail called the Singapore Sling. The legend says he designed it so that ladies, who were not supposed to drink alcohol in public, could hold something that looked like fruit juice. Like all good bar stories, the details are disputed, but the hotel itself was very real, and it stood for something. Singapore was no longer a rough frontier port. It was a crossroads of empire, a place the world had heard of. But we should be honest about what that glamour rested on, because this is the part the postcards left out. Colonial Singapore was a city of layers that barely touched. At the top, a small European community of officials and merchants who ran the government and the biggest firms, living in garden bungalows on the cool hills. Below them, a wealthy Asian merchant class, including the Peranakans, descendants of Chinese settlers who had woven Malay language and customs into a culture all their own, and who often served as the bridge between the British and everyone else. And beneath them all, the enormous labouring city, the dockworkers and rickshaw pullers and washerwomen, packed into shophouse districts so crowded that a single cubicle might sleep a family. Disease ran through those districts constantly. The rickshaw puller hauling a British banker to his club might be working himself to death by 40. As an economy, the system was brilliant. As a society, it was a pyramid, and the people at the bottom were carrying all of it. Still, by the 1920s, if you stood on the waterfront and watched the liners and freighters crowding the roads, you could believe the pyramid would stand forever. The British certainly believed it. They believed it so completely that they decided to build something here to guarantee it. A fortress so large, so expensive, so obviously invincible, that no enemy would ever dare to test it. Chapter 5. Fortress Singapore. Walk along the northern shore of Singapore today, at Sembawang, and you can still find the bones of that promise. There is a working shipyard there now, and naval vessels from friendly nations still tie up at the old wharves. A century ago, this quiet stretch of coast was chosen to hold the largest military project the British Empire ever attempted in Asia. To understand why, you have to go back to a question that kept planners in London awake at night after the First World War. The question was Japan. The First World War itself had barely touched Singapore. There was one violent shock in 1915, when Indian soldiers of the garrison mutinied and killed dozens of people before the rising was put down. A warning, in hindsight, about how thin British control really was. But the war's true impact arrived afterward. Japan had fought in that war as Britain's ally. Its navy had even escorted ships in the Mediterranean, But Japan was growing, industrializing, and building a fleet at a pace that alarmed everyone who could read a chart. In 1922, the great naval powers signed a treaty in Washington that froze their fleets at fixed ratios. And as part of that settlement, Britain let its old alliance with Japan lapse, which left a problem of pure geometry. Britain's navy was concentrated in home waters, on the other side of the planet. If Japan ever turned hostile, who would defend Australia, New Zealand, India, and the richest colonies of the East? The answer London chose in 1923 was not to station a fleet in Asia. Fleets are ruinously expensive. The answer was to build a base for a fleet that would come later. The plan was called the Singapore Strategy, and it worked like this. Britain would construct a massive naval base at Singapore, with docks, workshops, fuel reserves, and defences strong enough to hold out on their own. If war ever broke out in the East, the main British fleet would steam out from Europe, arrive within a matter of weeks, and operate from Singapore to crush the enemy. The base was the promise, the fleet was the payment, and the payment was always scheduled for later. Construction dragged on for 15 years, slowed by budget cuts and political fights. But what finally opened at Sembawang in 1938 was a wonder of the age. The base covered thousands of acres. Its centerpiece was the vast King George VI graving dock, a dry dock carved into the shore that ranked among the largest in the world. And alongside it floated a huge floating dock that had been towed out from Britain in an earlier stage of the project. Fuel tanks held enough oil to feed a fleet for months. The total cost ran to tens of millions of pounds, an immense sum in that era. Around it, the army installed batteries of heavy coastal guns, including 15-inch naval cannons, some of the largest ever mounted on land, sighted out over the sea approaches. Newspapers took to calling Singapore the Gibraltar of the East. Politicians called it impregnable. Winston Churchill would later admit he had assumed it could withstand a long siege. Now, you may have heard a famous story about those guns, that they were pointed the wrong way and could not fire at an enemy coming from the land. The truth, as historians have established, is more uncomfortable than the myth. Most of the guns could physically traverse to fire inland, and some did during the battle to come. The real problem was supply. The batteries had been stocked mainly for their intended role of sinking ships, with armor-piercing shells and too little of the high explosive ammunition needed against infantry spread through jungle and plantations. When the test came, the great guns would prove far less effective than their size suggested. They were an answer to the question London had chosen to imagine. An enemy fleet arriving by sea. They were poorly prepared for the question that would actually be asked, because the entire fortress rested on 3 assumptions, and every one of them was about to fail. The first assumption concerned the jungle of the Malay Peninsula, 400 miles of it between Singapore and Thailand. British planners did acknowledge that an attack could come overland from the north, and defence schemes for Malaya were drawn up on paper. But the preparations never matched the threat. The troops assigned were too few and largely untrained for jungle fighting. The promised modern aircraft never arrived in numbers. There were almost no tanks at all, and the northern defence works remained thin. Acknowledging a danger is not the same as preparing for it. The second assumption was that when the crisis came, the main British fleet would be free to sail east. But by 1940, Britain was fighting for its life against Germany in Europe. The fleet was needed in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The great naval base, the most expensive military project of the empire, would face its war with almost no fleet in it. And the third assumption was about the enemy. British commanders, soaked in the racial arrogance of the era, told each other that Japanese soldiers were small, poorly equipped, could not shoot straight, and could never match European troops. This was not intelligence. It was prejudice dressed up as analysis, and tens of thousands of people were about to pay for it. Meanwhile, the city beneath the fortress boomed and glittered. Through the 1930s, even as depression rocked the world and Japan's armies pushed into China, life in Singapore carried an almost dreamlike confidence. Planters drank their slings at the Raffles. New cinemas and amusement parks lit up the nights. Refugees and news from China told the Chinese community exactly what Japanese occupation looked like, and many raised funds for China's defense. But official Singapore slept soundly behind its big guns. The fortress existed. The fortress was invincible. Everyone said so. In December of 1941, on the same night, Japanese aircraft struck the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Bombs began falling on Singapore, and soldiers of the Japanese army waded ashore on beaches far to the north. The jungle everyone had filed away as impossible ground was about to open like a door. Chapter 6. 7 days in February. The Japanese commander tasked with taking Singapore had a problem that should have been unsolvable. His name was Tomoyuki Yamashita, and the plan he was handed in late 1941 asked him to march an army down 400 miles of jungle peninsula, cross a defended strait, and capture the most famous fortress in Asia, all before his supplies ran out. He would have roughly 30,000 frontline troops for the final assault. The defenders, counting all the British, Australian, Indian, and local forces on the peninsula and the island, would ultimately number well over 80,000, with some counts running higher. Yamashita would be outnumbered through the entire campaign. He decided the answer was speed. If he never stopped moving, the defenders would never have time to realize how few men were chasing them. His soldiers came equipped with something no one in London had wargamed: bicycles, thousands of them. When the tires burst in the heat, the men rode on the rims, and the clatter of steel wheels on jungle roads sounded to retreating troops in the dark, like approaching tanks. Japanese units moved down the peninsula at a pace that broke every calculation. When defenders formed a line across the road, the Japanese slipped through the rubber plantations around their flanks, or paddled down the coast in small boats and appeared behind them, blow a bridge, and the engineers repaired it in hours. Or the infantry simply waded the river, holding their rifles overhead. The 400 miles of supposedly impossible country were crossed in under 8 weeks. The second assumption, the fleet, died in a single afternoon. Britain had managed to scrape together a deterrent squadron and send it east, built around the battleship Prince of Wales, one of the newest in the Navy. and the battle cruiser Repulse. They arrived in Singapore to cheering crowds in early December. On the 10th of December, 1941, 3 days into the war, both ships sailed north to strike at the invasion convoys. Without air cover, Japanese bombers found them off the Malayan coast. And in a little over 2 hours, both ships were on the bottom of the South China Sea, along with hundreds of their crews. Churchill later wrote that in all the war he never received a more direct shock. A truth that navies had resisted for 20 years had arrived. Airplanes had made battleships prey, and Singapore now had no fleet, and no real air force either, because most of the obsolete British aircraft in Malaya had already been shot from the sky. By the end of January 1942, the last defenders streamed across the causeway onto Singapore Island and blew a hole in it behind them. Yamashita set up his headquarters in the Sultan's palace in Johore. Looking across the strait through binoculars at his prize, his supply situation was now strained to the limit. His artillery was rationed. His 30,000 men faced a garrison perhaps 3 times their size, dug in on an island. By every rule of military arithmetic, the siege should have lasted months. Yamashita would later portray the assault as a gamble, saying that a prolonged battle might have exposed how thin his ammunition and supplies had run. Historians still weigh how close to the edge he truly was, but his own account is telling. The conqueror of Singapore believed he was bluffing. The bluff worked in 7 days. On the night of the 8th of February, Japanese assault troops crossed the strait in armored barges and collapsible boats, landing in the mangrove swamps of the island's northwest. Exactly where the defense was thinnest, searchlights that were supposed to catch them were never switched on. By some accounts, because commanders feared giving away their positions. Within days, the Japanese held the high ground of Bukit Timah in the island's center. Along with most of the reservoirs and food depots, 1 million civilians were now crammed into the shrinking perimeter of the city under constant bombing and shell fire. And the water mains were failing. Fires burned along the waterfront. The dead lay in the streets faster than they could be buried. On the morning of the 15th of February, 1942, the British commander, Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, was told the water supply might last 1 more day. That afternoon, he walked under a white flag to a Ford motor factory at Bukit Timah, where Yamashita, determined to end things before his weakness was discovered, hammered the table and demanded an unconditional yes or no. Percival surrendered the fortress, the city, and everything in it. Somewhere in the range of 80,000 troops went into captivity in a single day, joining tens of thousands already captured on the peninsula. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. And it is hard to argue with him. The Empire's invincible fortress had fallen in exactly 1 week, to a smaller army running low on ammunition. Something else fell with it, something that could never be rebuilt. Asians across the region had watched the Europeans of the ruling empire flee, surrender, and march into prison camps guarded by Asian soldiers. The spell of European invincibility, the invisible foundation under every colonial government from India to Hong Kong, shattered in public. A generation of future independence leaders took note. Among the 1 million people watching in Singapore was an 18-year-old student named Harry Lee. who would later be known by his Chinese name, Lee Kuan Yew. He would say for the rest of his life that the fall of Singapore, and what came next, taught him that no one else could ever be trusted to protect his home. And what came next was worse than the battle. Chapter 7. The Years of Sorrow. The victors renamed the island Sionan too, the Light of the South. For the people who lived there, the 3.5 years under that name would be the darkest of the century. And the Chinese community would suffer first and worst. Japan had been at war with China since 1937, and Singapore's Chinese had raised money for China's defense, and some had fought as volunteers in the final battle, to the Japanese military, that made the entire community suspect. Within days of the surrender, the army began an operation the Chinese remember as Suk Ching, a term that means purge through cleansing. All Chinese men, roughly between the ages of 18 and 50, were ordered to report to mass screening centers. There, in scenes of terrifying randomness, hooded informers or officers picked men out of the lines. A pair of soft hands, a pair of glasses, a tattoo, a wrong answer, a schoolteacher's face. Any of it could be enough. Those who passed were stamped or given papers. Those who did not were loaded onto trucks, driven to remote beaches at Changi and Punggol and other sites, and machine-gunned at the water's edge. How many died in those weeks has never been settled, and it matters to say so honestly. Japanese officials after the war acknowledged a figure in the range of 5,000 or 6,000. Community leaders and later investigations in Singapore put the toll far higher, with estimates reaching into the tens of thousands, and figures up to 50,000 have been cited when the killings across the peninsula are included. The bones that surfaced in the 1960s, when construction crews kept digging up mass graves, made the scale impossible to deny, even if the exact number remains unknown. Lee Kuan Yew himself was pulled aside at a screening center and ordered onto a truck. He asked permission to go back for his clothes, slipped into the crowd, and hid for 2 days. The future founder of modern Singapore survived the occupation's first massacre by a sentence and a stroke of luck. For those who lived, the occupation settled into a long grey hunger. The port that had fed the island by trade was strangled by war, and food rations shrank month after month. Rice all but vanished, replaced by tapioca and sweet potatoes grown in every yard and roadside strip. Disease and malnutrition climbed. The occupation currency, printed so carelessly that people called the notes banana money after the pictures on them, collapsed into hyperinflation, until a sack of the bills might not buy a real meal. People sold heirlooms to farmers for food, and a black market ran on gold, cloth, and connections. Fear was a constant companion. The military police, the Kempe Tai, took over buildings in the city centre, and their name became a whisper. People were tortured on suspicion, on denunciation, on nothing. Neighbours learned to say little. Children were taught Japanese in school and taught silence at home. The prisoners of war endured their own dissent. Tens of thousands of British and Australian soldiers were penned at Changi, and from there many were shipped north in stages to build the Burma Railway through mountain jungle, a project so lethal that it consumed the lives of thousands of prisoners and a far greater number of Asian laborers, conscripted and coerced from across the region, who died in numbers that dwarf the military toll and are remembered far less. And yet, even in this darkness, there was resistance, guerrilla fighters, many of them Chinese communists who had escaped to the peninsula's jungles, harassed the occupiers for the entire war. An Allied unit called Force 136 smuggled agents back in by submarine. Among them, a Singapore businessman named Lim Bo Seng, who was captured, tortured for months, and died in prison without giving up his network. He is honored today as a national hero. A hospital worker named Elizabeth Choi smuggled food, money, and messages to prisoners, was arrested and brutally tortured by the Kempeitai, and survived to become one of the most beloved figures of post-war Singapore. Ordinary people performed a quieter resistance measured in hidden radios, forged papers, and shared food. The end, when it came from far away. In August of 1945, atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union crashed into Japan's armies in Manchuria, and the emperor announced surrender. In Singapore, the war simply stopped, and for several strange weeks, the island hung between masters until British troops returned in September to crowds that cheered them ashore. Yamashita, the conqueror, was tried and hanged in the Philippines for atrocities committed by his troops there. The formal surrender of Japanese forces in Southeast Asia was signed in Singapore's City Hall. But watch those cheering crowds carefully, because history was pivoting inside them. They were glad the hunger and the terror were over. That was not the same thing as welcoming the empire back. The British had made one promise above all, that their fortress would protect this island. And when the test came, they had failed absolutely. Then left 1 million people to 3.5 years of massacre and starvation. A colonial government can survive being hated. It cannot survive being found useless. In the crowds stood survivors of the screening centers, veterans of the resistance, and a sharp-eyed young man named Lee, now in his early 20s, who had watched 2 empires rule his home by force. The thought forming in his generation was simple and irreversible. Never again would anyone else hold Singapore's fate. The age of European empire in Asia had entered its final crisis. It just had not admitted it yet. Chapter 8. The Lawyer from Cambridge. Harry Lee Kuan Yew was born in 1923 into a comfortable English-speaking Chinese family, the kind of family that named its sons Harry and Dennis and expected them to rise smoothly inside the British system. He was the star student of his generation, top of his cohort in the colonies' examinations. Then the war came, and the system he was raised to join collapsed in front of him. He survived the Suk Ching screening by luck. He watched people beaten in the street for failing to bow, and he did what survivors do. He adapted. He learned Japanese and, as he recounted in his own memoirs, worked for a time as a transcriber in a Japanese propaganda department while trading on the black market to keep his family fed. The lesson he took from those years, in his own telling, was brutally simple. Power decides everything, and the British no longer had it here. When the war ended, he sailed for England and did what he had been built to do. He won. At Cambridge, he took a rare double first in law. And his future wife, Kwa Yew, one of the only people whose exam results had ever beaten his, earned first-class honours alongside him. They married secretly in England in 1947, a detail they kept from their families for years. But the more interesting education was happening outside the lecture halls. In post-war Britain, Lee watched a weary empire begin letting its colonies go. And he moved through student circles where young men from across Asia were all asking the same question, not whether independence would come, but who would hold power when it did. He returned to Singapore in 1950 and found a city that answered the question for him. The port was busy again, but the society around it was boiling. And to understand the next 15 years, you have to understand a dividing line that ran straight through the Chinese community itself. On one side stood a small minority educated in English, people like Lee, who could work in the courts, the banks, and the civil service, and who lived, in effect, inside the colonial system. On the other side stood the vast majority educated in Chinese, in schools that the colonial government barely funded and quietly distrusted. A brilliant graduate of a Chinese high school found the doors of government and the professions mostly closed to him. His degrees carried little weight in an English-speaking state. He lived in a different world of clan associations, Chinese newspapers, and crowded working-class districts. And he saw, every day, that the system had no place for him. That grievance, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of people, was the most powerful political fuel on the island. Strikes rolled through the docks and bus companies. Students in the Chinese schools organized and marched. And rising out of that world came the most electric political force in Singapore, the radical left, tied to militant unions and, at its edge, to an outlawed communist movement fresh from fighting the Japanese in the jungles. Its brightest star was a young union organizer named Lim Chin Siong. He was in his early 20s, soft-spoken in private and mesmerizing in public. In Hokkien, the dialect of the working crowds, he could hold thousands of dock workers and factory girls breathless, telling them their poverty was not fate but policy. To the laboring Chinese majority, he was one of their own, the voice the colony had never allowed them. Lee could not do any of that. He was a London-trained lawyer who was still improving his own Chinese. A man of the courtroom, not the rally. He had the skills to negotiate with the British, and no crowd of his own. The left had the crowds and needed someone who could beat the empire in its own language and its own courts. So Lee became the legal advisor to the striking unions. And in November of 1954, in a packed theatre, he and a small circle of allies launched the People's Action Party, the PAP, in open alliance with the Union left. It was a partnership of necessity between two groups who did not fully trust each other, and both sides knew it. Lee would later describe the arrangement with a phrase that stuck: riding the tiger. Through the mid-1950s, Singapore burned through strikes and riots, including clashes around a bus company dispute in 1955 in which several people were killed, and student occupations of Chinese schools. Britain, exhausted and reading the direction of history, chose managed retreat, offering the colony steps towards self-rule. 2 chief ministers rose and fell, trying to govern the fire. The flamboyant lawyer David Marshall, who resigned when London refused him full self-government, and the tougher Lim Yew Hock, whose crackdowns on leftists, including the detention of Lim Chin Seong after riots in 1956, made him useful to the British and hated on the street. Lee, meanwhile, played a long and careful game, staying credible with the masses while quietly persuading the British that only the Pap could deliver a stable, non-communist Singapore. When London granted full internal self-government, elections were held in May of 1959, and the Pap swept them, taking 43 of 51 seats. At 35 years old, Lee Kuan Yew became Prime Minister, and one of his first acts was to secure the release of Lim Chin Seong and his comrades from detention. The tiger and its rider were still together. Neither expected that to last. Lee inherited a country in trouble. Unemployment was high and rising, with some estimates around 1 in 10 workers and worse among the young. Most of the population was crammed into some of the worst slums in Asia, and his own party was still 2 parties wearing 1 badge. Moderates holding the offices, leftists holding the streets. When the break finally came, it would be fought over a single question. Should Singapore, this tiny, self-governing island, merge with its giant neighbor to the north and become part of a new country called Malaysia? Chapter 9. The Marriage That Failed. Look at the map through Lee Kuan Yew's eyes in 1961, and the case for merger looked like arithmetic. Singapore was a port city of under 2 million people with no countryside, no resources, and unemployment climbing. Its natural economic hinterland, the source of its water and much of its trade, was the Federation of Malaya across the causeway. Merge with Malaya. The argument ran, and Singapore gains a common market for its factories and a future beyond the shrinking empire. To Lee, it was more than economics. He argued publicly that independence alone was a fantasy, that an island this small could not survive by itself. Remember that claim. History is about to run the experiment. Malaya's leader, the aristocratic and easygoing Tunku Abdul Rahman, saw a different calculation. He did not particularly want Singapore. Its politics were turbulent and its population overwhelmingly Chinese, which would tip the delicate racial balance of his Malay-led federation. What changed his mind was fear. The left wing of the Pap had finally split from Lee in 1961, forming a rival party led by Lim Chin Seong that looked capable of winning power. From Kuala Lumpur, the nightmare was an independent, radical, possibly communist Singapore sitting at the foot of the peninsula, a Cuba across the causeway. Better to swallow the island and control it. So the deal was struck on fear on both sides. And to balance the numbers, the British territories of Sabah and Sarawak on the island of Borneo were folded in as well. In February of 1963, before the merger took effect, the government in Singapore and its partners moved against the left in a dawn sweep called Operation Cold Store, detaining more than 100 politicians and unionists without trial, Lim Chin Seong among them, on the grounds of a communist conspiracy. Historians still debate how real and how organized that conspiracy was by then, and declassified documents have kept the argument alive. What no one debates is the result. The Pap's most dangerous rivals were in prison when Singapore entered Malaysia that September. And the man who had once been the most popular politician on the island never held power. We will meet the method again. Almost nothing about the marriage worked. Indonesia's President Sukarno denounced the new federation as a colonial puppet and launched a campaign of armed confrontation, landing raiders on the peninsula and sending saboteurs into Singapore, where a bombing at the McDonald House office building in 1965 killed 3 people. Trade with Indonesia, one of Singapore's lifelines, collapsed under the embargo. The promised common market never truly arrived. But the fatal conflict was political, and it was about race. The Federation's ruling party in Kuala Lumpur was built on a compact of Malay political primacy, with special constitutional privileges for Malays as the indigenous community. The PAP began contesting seats on the mainland and preaching a rival vision it called a Malaysian Malaysia, meaning equal treatment for every citizen regardless of race, a message electric to the Chinese and Indian populations and radioactive to the Malay establishment. Extremist voices in the Kuala Lumpur press painted Lee as a threat to the Malay people. In Singapore, the poison caught fire in the streets. In July of 1964, during a Muslim religious procession, fighting broke out between Malays and Chinese and spiraled into island-wide riots. Official accounts put the dead in the dozens, with hundreds injured, and a second round of rioting followed weeks later. For a city that prided itself on centuries of communities trading side by side, the riots were a wound and a warning, and their memory would shape Singapore's obsession with racial harmony for the next 60 years. By 1965, the marriage was 2 years old, and both partners were talking past each other toward disaster. Some in Kuala Lumpur reportedly urged the arrest of Lee, the Tunku, recovering from illness abroad and dreading either bloodshed or a political war he might lose, chose a third option almost without precedent in the modern world. He decided to expel Singapore from the country. The negotiations were conducted in near total secrecy. A handful of men on each side drafting the divorce while Parliament and the public knew nothing. Lee's deputies signed. The vote in the Malaysian Parliament on the 9th of August, 1965, was unanimous, 126-0. Singapore was out. That afternoon, Lee Kuan Yew faced the television cameras to tell his people they were now citizens of a sovereign state that no one, including him, had ever wanted to exist. Countries usually celebrate their Independence Day. Lee wept on his. He told the country that looking back on this hour, it will be a moment of anguish. Then he stopped, asked the press for a moment, and sat in silence while the cameras rolled. A leader recovering his composure in front of the nation he now had to save. It remains one of the only recorded cases in modern history of a leader crying not because his country had died, but because it had been born. Strip away the emotion and look at what he was actually staring at. A city of about 2 million people, cut loose against its will. No army worth the name. No natural resources at all. Its drinking water piped in from the country that had just expelled it. Its other giant neighbor openly hostile and still landing saboteurs. unemployment high, and a port whose entire logic, serving a hinterland, had just been amputated. Lee had spent years arguing that an independent Singapore could not survive. Now the argument was over. He had lost it, and survival was his job. Chapter 10. Survival Mode. The cold decision came first, and it shocked everyone who thought they knew what a newly independent country was supposed to do. Across Asia and Africa in the 1960s, the script of independence was the same everywhere. Throw out the colonizers, nationalize their businesses, reject Western capital as a new form of empire, and build your own industries behind high walls. That was the fashion, the ideology, the applause line. Lee Kuan Yew and his economic architect, a brilliant and famously blunt economist named Goh Keng Swee, looked at the script and threw it away. Singapore had no domestic market worth protecting and no resources to nationalize. So they did the opposite of everyone else. They invited the multinationals in, American, European, Japanese corporations, the very symbols of Western capitalism, were offered tax breaks, industrial land, disciplined labor, and a government that answered inquiries in days instead of years. While much of the developing world was showing foreign capital the door, Singapore stood at the harbour waving it in. Critics in the region called it selling out. Lee called it jobs. There was luck in the timing, and honesty requires naming it. The late 1960s were exactly the moment American electronics firms began looking for low-cost places to assemble their products. In 1968, Texas Instruments arrived to make semiconductors, and others followed fast. National Semiconductor, Hewlett-Packard, General Electric, the American war in Vietnam, whatever else it was doing to the region, was also pouring money through it. And historians of the period note that Singapore's ship repair yards, fuel suppliers, and service industries drew real business from that spending. The island profited from a war it took no part in. One more entry in its long ledger of geographic luck. Oil companies came too. Shell and its rivals built refineries on the southern islands until this country, with not one drop of crude oil, became one of the great oil refining centers of the world. That is Singapore's economy in one image. Own nothing. Process everything. Now put a face on it, because statistics do not sweat. Imagine a girl of 19 in the year 1970, and understand that there were tens of thousands of her. She grew up in a kampong, a village of wooden houses and zinc roofs, hauling water from a standpipe, her father a fisherman or a labourer. She finishes school, and instead of following her mother into the kampong economy, she takes a bus each morning to a new industrial estate at a place called Jurong, a name that a few years earlier meant swamp and crocodiles. She puts on a smock, sits at a bench under fluorescent light, and solders components bound for American televisions and calculators. Her wage is small by American standards and a fortune by her family's. She is, without knowing it, one of the first soldiers of the economic miracle, and we will meet her again. The young country was building on ground that kept shaking. In 1967, Britain announced it would withdraw its military forces from east of Suez, and the timetable soon accelerated. For Singapore, this was not just a security crisis. The British bases were the island's biggest employer after the government. And by common estimates, the military presence generated somewhere around a fifth of the entire economy. Imagine a town where the factory that pays every fifth family announces it is leaving forever. And the factory is also the army that protects you. That was 1968. The government converted the naval dockyard, including the great graving dock built for a fleet that never came, into a commercial ship repair yard, retrained workers, and pushed even harder for foreign factories. The unemployment bomb that everyone predicted never went off. Defense had to be conjured from nothing, and the way it was done stayed secret for years. Singapore asked several countries for help building an army, and the country that answered was Israel, another small state surrounded by larger neighbors. Israeli military advisors arrived quietly, and to avoid inflaming sensitivities in a region with large Muslim populations. They were referred to inside the system as Mexicans, a disguise Lee himself later confirmed in his memoirs. On their model, Singapore built national service. From 1967 onward, every young male citizen was conscripted, trained, and folded into a growing reserve. A country of 2 million could not keep a large standing army, but it could turn its whole male population into one, and then there was the problem you could see from every window. Housing. Singapore in 1965 was still substantially a city of slums and squatter settlements, and everyone remembered the fire of 1961, when a blaze tore through the shanty town of Bukit Ho Swee and left around 16,000 people homeless in a single afternoon. The Housing and Development Board, the HDB, had been founded in 1960, and it built with a speed that still astonishes urban planners. Standardized apartment blocks rose in months. Squatters were moved, sometimes with real pain and protest, into flats with running water, electricity, and their own front doors. Then came the masterstroke. Instead of renting the flats out and creating a class of permanent public tenants, the government let citizens buy them, using their mandatory retirement savings in the Central Provident Fund for the down payment. Within a generation, the overwhelming majority of Singaporeans lived in public housing that they owned. It is one of the strangest hybrids in economics. A socialist housing program that manufactured a nation of property-owning capitalists. And it gave every family a brick and mortar stake in the country's survival. Our girl from the kampong is part of that story too. By the late 1970s, she is married, and she and her husband carry their savings book to an HDB office and put their names on a flat in a new town. The first people in either of their families ever to own a home. Underneath all of it ran two quieter policies that mattered as much as any factory. The first was language. The government kept English as the working language of government and business. A decision that stung national pride in a mostly Chinese city, but plugged Singapore directly into global trade and, crucially, made no ethnic group's mother tongue the master of the others. The second was the war on corruption. The Anti-Corruption Bureau was given teeth and pointed at the powerful, and over the years, ministers and senior officials were prosecuted and ruined. In a region where a customs stamp often had a private price, Singapore made honesty a brand, and investors noticed Add it up. The factories, the port, the flats, the army, the clean books, and the numbers start to look unreal. Through the 1970s, the economy grew at rates that often reached double digits. Unemployment, the monster of 1965, fell year after year until factories were short of workers. The experiment Lee said could never work was outrunning almost every economy on Earth. But growth was only half the story. The other half was control, and the price of it. Chapter 11. The Miracle and Its Price. Here is the statistic that gets Singapore taught in American business schools. In 1965, Singapore's economic output per person, measured in the United States dollars of the day, sat somewhere in the low 500s, in the same neighborhood as many middle-income countries of that era. By 1990, it had passed 12,000 of those current dollars, a rise of more than 20 times over in raw terms. And even after you strip out inflation and currency swings, the real growth remains extraordinary. Few economies in recorded history have moved from that starting point to the global high-income tier so quickly. At any scale. Economists still argue about the recipe. Almost no one argues about the result. You could see it from the air and from the sea. In 1981, Changi Airport opened on land, partly reclaimed from the ocean, and it began collecting Best in the World awards almost immediately. In the harbour, Singapore had bet early on a boxy new invention called the shipping container, while older ports hesitated. And by the 1980s, it was racing Hong Kong and Rotterdam for the title of busiest container port on the planet. The kampong villages faded into memory. And our factory girl from Jurong, now a mother in an HDB new town, watched her own children study in schools that drilled them in English and mathematics for an economy she could not have imagined at their age. A tourist who had visited in 1965 and returned in 1985 would have doubted their own eyes. Now comes the part of the story that this video owes you straight. Because the same 25 years look very different from inside a prison cell. You already saw the method in 1963, when Operation Cold Store put over 100 leftists behind bars without trial on the eve of merger. The method did not retire when the emergency passed. A former assemblyman named Chia Thai Po, arrested in 1966, was held without ever being convicted of anything for 23 years. And then kept under restrictions for years more, a span of confinement longer than most convicted murderers serve anywhere. As late as 1987, the government detained a circle of young Catholic social workers and activists in an operation it said had uncovered a Marxist conspiracy, a claim many of the detainees and later observers disputed, and several of those detained said publicly that they were mistreated in custody. The government has always maintained that these detentions were lawful and necessary for security. The people who lost decades of their lives to them have always maintained otherwise. Both statements belong in this story. Opposition politics survived. Barely. As a kind of endurance sport. For 15 years after 1966, Parliament did not contain a single opposition member. When a lawyer named J.B. Jeyaretnam finally broke through and won a seat in 1981, the years that followed brought him a long succession of lawsuits and prosecutions that eventually saw him fined. bankrupted, and stripped of his seat, his supporters saw the cases as political punishment for the sin of winning. The government maintained that every case rested on legitimate legal grounds and that no politician stood above the law. What is beyond dispute is the pattern's effect. Critics came to describe defamation suits as a signature political weapon in Singapore, because leaders who said they had been defamed sued, won, and collected damages large enough to ruin a defendant, and every opposition politician in the country could read the price list. The press learned the price list too. Newspapers that pushed too hard in the 1970s saw editors detained or papers shut, and a 1974 law gave the government effective influence over who controlled the surviving publications. Foreign magazines that offended were not banned outright. Their circulation was simply restricted. A punishment with a bureaucrat's precision, and the state's reach extended into private life. Alarmed by falling birth rates among educated women, the government in 1983 announced incentives favoring graduate mothers, a policy so nakedly eugenic in flavor that it caused a public backlash and was largely abandoned within a couple of years. The earlier campaign that told families to stop at 2 children worked so well it had to be thrown into reverse, replaced in 1987 by a plea to have 3 or more if you can afford it. Even chewing gum would eventually be banned in the early 1990s after vandals gummed up the new subway's door sensors. A small law that became the West's favorite shorthand for the whole system. Lee Kuan Yew defended all of it, openly and without apology, for the rest of his life. He argued that Western-style liberal democracy was a luxury of size and safety, that a tiny, multiracial country, one riot away from disaster, needed discipline more than it needed dissent, and that his government answered to voters in real elections every few years. Elections the PAP kept winning with large majorities. His critics answered that the elections were held on a field tilted by lawsuits, detentions, gerrymandering, and a controlled press, and that the choice between chaos and one-party rule was a false one. That debate, order against liberty, is one of the oldest arguments in political thought, and Singapore is its most cited modern exhibit. Where you land on it probably says as much about you as about Singapore. What no honest observer can do is take only half the picture. The gleaming airport without the prison cell, or the prison cell without the housing blocks. It was one system. It came as a package. In November of 1990, Lee Kuan Yew did something many long-ruling leaders resist. After 31 years as Prime Minister, with his party unbeaten and his health intact, he stood up in front of the country and handed the job to someone else. The question every Singaporean asked, some with hope and some with dread, was the oldest question about systems built around one man. What happens to the machine when the man steps away from the controls? Chapter 12. The System Without Its Founder. The man who inherited the machine was chosen, in part because he was nothing like its builder. Goh Chok Tong was a tall, mild-mannered economist from a poor family, a man who had risen through the shipping industry and the civil service on quiet competence. Where Lee Kuan Yew radiated intensity, Goh promised something Singaporeans had never actually been offered before, exemplaire. more consultative style of government, and in one of the stranger details of the transition, the old man did not leave. Lee stayed in the cabinet with a title invented for him: Senior Minister, an arrangement his critics compared to a driving instructor who never gets out of the car. Go publicly embraced the arrangement, and then spent 14 years proving he was more than a caretaker. His first great test in the eyes of the world arrived. Of all places, from Ohio. In 1993, an 18-year-old American named Michael Fay, a student at an international school in Singapore, was arrested in a spree of vandalism, chiefly the spray painting of cars. In 1994, a Singapore court sentenced him to a fine, a jail term, and 6 strokes of the cane, a punishment inherited from British colonial law and applied to thousands of offenders in Singapore each year. In America, the story detonated. This was a friendly, hypermodern trading partner sentencing an American teenager to be lashed with a rattan cane. And for weeks, the case led news broadcasts and filled talk radio. President Bill Clinton called the punishment excessive and appealed for clemency. Newspapers debated whether Singapore was a vision of order or a warning about it. And to the surprise of many commentators, polls and letters pages showed a large share of Americans weary of crime at home, siding with Singapore. The government in Singapore reduced the sentence from 6 strokes to 4 in deference to the American president, and then carried it out. It was, in its strange way, Singapore's loudest introduction to the American public in a generation. And the argument it started, order against liberty again, was the same one running through this whole story. The 1990s brought the system a far bigger test. In the summer of 1997, a collapsing currency in Thailand triggered a financial panic that tore through Asia. The Thai baht fell. Then the Indonesian rupiah collapsed. Then the Korean won. And economies the world had spent a decade calling miracle tigers were suddenly begging for international rescue packages. Next door, the crisis turned political. Indonesia's economy shrank catastrophically. Riots swept Jakarta. And President Suharto, after 3 decades in power, resigned in 1998 while the region held its breath. Singapore took the punch and stayed standing. And the reasons why are a fair test of everything the system claimed about itself. The country had almost no short-term foreign debt, enormous reserves, banks that regulators had forced to stay conservative, and a currency managed with obsessive caution. The economy dipped into recession. Wages were cut through the national wage system rather than through mass layoffs. And then growth resumed. For the men who ran Singapore, the crisis was the ultimate vindication. All those decades of being called boring, over-regulated, and paranoid. And when the flood came, the boring house was the one still standing. Then the new century opened with a run of blows. The dot-com crash in 2001 hit the electronics exports at the heart of the economy. The September 11th attacks that same year rewrote global security. And Singapore soon announced it had broken up a regional terrorist cell plotting to bomb targets in the city, including Western embassies. And in the spring of 2003 came the strangest enemy of all. A new virus called SARS arrived from Hong Kong, carried by a traveler, and began killing Singapore's response was a preview of a world that would not arrive for everyone else until 2020. Mass temperature screening, aggressive contact tracing, quarantine orders with teeth, entire hospitals locked down. The outbreak killed 33 people in Singapore, sickened hundreds, and emptied the airport and the malls for months. Hold on to that memory. 17 years later, it would be tested again. And we will see how that test went before this story ends. Through it all, Goh steered his own quiet evolution in style. He held national conversations, loosened some cultural rules, and allowed a little more space at the edges of public life. But the deeper structure never moved. Elections stayed tilted in the view of the opposition. Defamation suits still ruined critics. And Singapore in the Goh years was often described as a slightly warmer version of the same climate. In August of 2004, Goh stepped aside as gracefully as he had stepped up, and the third Prime Minister of Singapore was sworn in. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. He was a brigadier general, a Cambridge-trained mathematician of formidable reputation, a survivor of cancer in his 40s, and by nearly every account, a man of genuine ability. He was also the eldest son of Lee Kuan Yew, and the family name landed on the office like a question mark that has never fully lifted. The government's answer was consistent and not absurd. He had been tested for decades in the most demanding jobs the state could offer, and no one seriously accused him of incompetence. The skeptic's answer was just as simple. In a true meritocracy of several million people, what are the odds that the best person for the top job happens to be the founder's son? Both arguments deserve their place, and Singaporeans have been weighing them ever since. The son took over a country that was rich, safe, and quietly anxious. Hong Kong and Shanghai were racing for its financial crown. Cheaper Asian ports were racing for its shipping. The economy needed a new act, and the new Prime Minister found one in the last place anyone expected. The one industry his father had spent 40 years refusing to touch. Chapter 13. The Casino Bet. To understand why the announcement of 2005 stunned Singapore, you have to understand what gambling meant to the old guard. Lee Kuan Yew had seen the syndicates of the colonial era, the ruined Coolies, the gangs fattened on gambling debts. His government had built its identity on discipline and clean living. He was quoted for decades saying that a casino would come to Singapore only over his dead body. That is why, when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong stood up in Parliament in April of 2005 and announced that Singapore would license not one but 2 casino resorts, it was more than an economic decision. It was a generational one. The father, still sitting in cabinet, publicly accepted that the world had changed, and that the risk of standing still had grown larger than the risk of the tables. The government being the government. Even Vice arrived, wrapped in bureaucracy. The word casino barely appeared. These would be integrated resorts, where gambling floors were legally capped as a small fraction of developments packed with convention halls, museums, theatres, and hotels. And in a policy that may be unique on Earth, the entry fee was aimed at the owner's own citizens. Foreign tourists walked in free, while Singaporeans paid a steep levy at the door. reported at launch as 100 Singapore dollars a day, a sin tax designed to protect locals from the very industry being built to enrich them. The bet was enormous. The two projects together drew what was reported as more than 10 billion United States dollars in investment, among the most expensive resort developments ever built at the time. The American company Las Vegas Sands built its resort on reclaimed land at Marina Bay, and its architect, Moshe Safdie, delivered something nobody could ignore. 3 towers of 55 stories, crowned by a single connected platform longer than the Eiffel Tower is tall, shaped like a ship sailing across the sky, holding gardens, restaurants, an observation deck marketed as Level 57, and an infinity pool whose edge appears to pour into the skyline. Marina Bay Sands opened in 2010, alongside its rival resort on Sentosa Island, and the gamble paid out almost immediately. Within a few years, industry reports ranked Singapore among the most lucrative casino markets in the world. Tourism jumped, and the towers became the most photographed silhouette in the country. Remember, this video opened on that rooftop. The building you were standing on at the start of this story is the monument to the moment Singapore decided reinvention mattered more than its own rules. The same 2 decades turned the city into something else its founders had chased for generations. A true global financial capital. As Beijing tightened political control over Hong Kong after the protests of 2019 and the national security law of 2020, some banks, funds, and wealthy families increased their presence in Singapore, and wealth managers reported record inflows. The island did not replace Hong Kong, but it no longer stood in its shadow. The port held its rank among the busiest container hubs on Earth, and the state's investment funds quietly owned stakes in companies across the planet. The expelled island of 1965 was now a creditor to the world. And then, in the early hours of the 23rd of March, 2015, the founder died. Lee Kuan Yew was 91. What followed took even Singaporeans by surprise. The state had planned a dignified funeral. What it got was an outpouring. People began lining up to file past the casket at Parliament House, and the line grew until it ran for hours through the night. Hundreds of thousands of people over several days. Office workers and grandmothers and students who had never known any other Singapore. Somewhere in that line, you can be sure, stood women in their 60s who had once been factory girls in Jurong, who had started life-hauling water in a kampong and were now waiting in the air-conditioned night to say goodbye to the man whose government had moved them into their own homes, and who had also, for all those same years, decided what they could read and how loudly they could disagree. Both of those things were true at once. That was the point of him. On the day of the funeral procession, the sky opened into a tropical downpour, and vast crowds stood in the rain anyway, drenched, waving flags as the gun carriage passed. Some called the rain fitting for a man who had cried for this country on television 50 years earlier. Now the country cried back. His son delivered the eulogy, and in his final years the old man had asked for one more thing, and it said everything about him. He requested that his own house on Oxley Road be demolished after his death rather than preserved as a shrine, reportedly because he wanted no personality cult, and the family's later public quarrel over that house. played out in 2017 in dueling statements between his children, became the most painful public argument in the nation's history. Even in death, the founder had handed Singapore one final, unresolved question about what to do with his legacy. The founder was gone. The second generation was aging. The world that had made Singapore rich, open trade, American security, a rising and friendly China, was starting to crack, which brings us to the present, and to the question this entire video has been building toward. Chapter 14. The Richest Country on Earth. Start with the claim in this video's title. Because you deserve to see the receipts. Is Singapore really the richest country in the world? Measured by total economic size? Obviously not. It is a speck beside America or China. The serious version of the claim uses output per person adjusted for what money actually buys. Purchasing power. And on that measure, the rankings compiled by institutions like the International Monetary Fund have for years placed Singapore at or near the very top of the world, trading places with tiny Luxembourg and gas-rich Qatar, depending on the year and the method. So here is the honest answer. On income per person adjusted for purchasing power, Singapore consistently ranks among the richest economies on Earth. And by some rankings first, that does not mean the average Singaporean is the richest person on Earth, because a nation's output and a household's take-home pay are different things, and other measures shuffle the podium. But by the standards any economist would accept, the island, the world once dismissed as a fishing village, now stands beside the wealthiest societies human beings have ever built. The journey Lee Kuan Yew described in the title of his own memoirs, From Third World to First, happened inside a single lifetime. That much is verified. And before we weigh that miracle, one debt from earlier in this story has to be paid. When COVID swept the planet in 2020, the muscle memory from SARS was still there. Singapore locked its borders, traced contacts with an intensity few free societies attempted, and by the pandemic's end, its death rate ranked among the lowest of any major economy on Earth. But the crisis also lit up the system's blind spot. The virus tore through the crowded dormitories of the migrant laborers who build the country. Men from Bangladesh and India and beyond. Tens of thousands infected in housing. Most Singaporeans had never seen the inside. The state contained it, and was praised abroad, and was asked hard questions at home about who exactly the miracle was for. Even in a pandemic, Singapore ran true to form. Astonishing competence. Uncomfortable questions. Both at once. Now walk the streets in 2026 and listen. Because the country at the summit is not relaxed. The first anxiety is the price of paradise. Surveys by groups like the Economist Intelligence Unit have repeatedly ranked Singapore among the most expensive cities on Earth. Sometimes the single most expensive, a modest car can cost more than a house in much of America once the famous ownership permits are counted. Housing prices and rents surged after the pandemic. The government points out, fairly, that most citizens live in subsidized flats they own and enjoy services the world envies. Young Singaporeans answer, also fairly, that they study harder work longer, and compete more brutally than their parents did for a life that feels harder to reach. There is a local word for the national temperament, kiasu, the fear of losing out. The fear built the miracle. It also exhausts the miracle's children. A second anxiety is demographic, and it may be the most dangerous enemy Singapore has ever faced, because you cannot deter it with an army. The resident fertility rate has, in recent years, fallen below 1 child per woman, among the lowest figures recorded anywhere, far under the level that keeps a population steady. The government has thrown money at the problem for decades. Baby bonuses, housing priority, parental leave, and the needle has barely moved. Think of our factory girl from Jurong one last time. She had fewer children than her mother and her daughter. A professional in her 30s with a degree and a mortgage may have 1 child or none. Nobody in that family did anything wrong. Each generation simply answered the incentives in front of it. And the sum of those rational answers is a nation that is quietly running out of Singaporeans. The gap is filled by immigration, which keeps the economy running and the politics simmering. Because a population now past 6 million on that same small island means crowded trains, competition for jobs, and hard questions about identity. A nation built by immigrants now argues, as America does, about immigrants. The third anxiety is the oldest one. The map. Singapore got rich in an American-ordered world of open sea lanes and free trade, while selling to a booming China. For decades it never had to choose between the two, and choosing is the nightmare, because the American Navy underwrites its security while China anchors its commerce. As those two giants drift toward rivalry, the little island at the crossroads practices a diplomacy of almost surgical balance, hosting American forces while banking Chinese trade. And its leaders have said publicly, in various forms, that they hope never to be forced to pick a side. Nobody can promise they won't be. Politics at home is shifting too, gently but unmistakably. The PAP has now governed without interruption for more than 65 years, one of the longest runs of any elected party on earth. But the elections of 2011 and 2020 saw its support dip to historic lows and the opposition win real footholds. In 2024, Lee Hsien Loong stepped down, and power passed to Lawrence Wong, Singapore's first Prime Minister, born after independence, and the first leader from outside the Lee family since Goh Chok Tong left the office 20 years earlier, a civil servant's son and a guitar-playing economist who had fronted the pandemic task force. Wong led the PAP into the general election of 2025 and won back part of the ground the party had lost, while the opposition Workers' Party held its main strongholds. Voters, it seemed, still preferred the devil they knew when the world looked dangerous. But the fourth generation now governs a population that has never known poverty, never known riots, and increasingly asks not whether Singapore can survive, but what surviving is for. So let's end where we began, on that rooftop above Marina Bay, looking down at the ships stacked to the horizon. Everything below you is an argument made of steel and glass. The argument says that geography can be beaten, that a swamp can out-earn an empire, that discipline can substitute for oil fields and farmland, and that a state can pull a society into the first rank of nations in a single generation. If it is willing to pay the price in control, Temasek rose and fell. Colonial Singapore rose and fell. Modern Singapore has risen higher than either. On the same rock, beside the same strait, playing the same role it played 700 years ago. The toll booth of Asia. The location never changed. Only the management did. The founders' generation answered the question of survival. Their grandchildren must answer a harder one. When the fear that built a nation finally fades, what holds it together? Singapore has beaten geography, poverty, and its own improbable history. The one thing it has never yet had to survive is comfort. Whether it can, well, that is the next chapter, and it has not been written yet.